So, what Princess Anne just executed behind the velvet-draped doors of the palace is, without a doubt, one of the most ruthlessly efficient, quietly devastating power transfers in the history of the modern British monarchy. And honestly, the absolute most fascinating element of this entire saga is the sheer, deafening silence in which it was carried out. We are not talking about a grand, televised press conference. We are not looking at a highly coordinated, heavily sanitized public relations rollout leaked to a sympathetic Sunday paper. We are talking about a single, definitive stroke of a fountain pen inside a deeply secured private administrative office. A single signature that instantaneously shifted the ultimate control of one of the late Queen Elizabeth's most fiercely guarded, highly personal private estates. The resulting fallout was absolutely immediate, and it was entirely explosive. Within a matter of hours, according to an overwhelming consensus of elite royal commentators and palace insiders who have touched the edges of this story, the internal switchboards were practically melting down. High-ranking courtiers, who pride themselves on knowing everything, suddenly realized they had been entirely, deliberately locked out of the information loop. The sprawling network of extended family members and opportunistic insiders who genuinely believed they possessed a permanent, unshakable seat at the decision-making table woke up to the jarring reality that the entire room had been dismantled and rebuilt without them. Standing at the absolute center of this newly drawn kingdom holding the administrative keys is Catherine, the Princess of Wales, and standing completely out in the cold, staring at a locked gate, is the wider circle surrounding Queen Camilla. That specific divide is exactly where this narrative stops being a simple real estate transaction and becomes something genuinely, structurally profound. Because this maneuver is not fundamentally about acreage, property values, or land management. It is entirely about legacy. It is about who the late Queen actually trusted to carry her deepest, most personal history forward into the next century. And the definitive answer to that lingering question has apparently left a specific faction of the current royal court absolutely, unconditionally furious. If you are fascinated by the hidden mechanics, the unspoken strategies, and the real power dynamics operating behind the palace walls, do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button to join us here at Royal Prime. We strip away the tabloid spin and break down these massive institutional shifts every single week. All right, let's deeply deconstruct exactly what transpired here, because the granular operational details of this maneuver are infinitely more compelling than the sensationalized headlines. To understand the absolute finality of this decision, you have to understand the specific psychology of the woman who executed it. Princess Anne has spent the entirety of her public, highly scrutinized life building an impenetrable, bulletproof brand around one solitary concept: absolute, unyielding duty. She does not engage in petty palace drama. She does not authorize vindictive media leaks. She absolutely refuses to participate in the toxic, cyclical whisper networks that seem to function as the primary currency for so much of modern royal life. She simply shows up, she does the grueling, unglamorous work required of her, and she goes home. That has been her ironclad operational strategy for decades. Therefore, when she ultimately stepped forward to make this colossal, legally binding decision regarding Queen Elizabeth's private sovereign estate, it landed on the palace floor with the kind of crushing, undeniable weight that can only be generated by a human being who has never, not once, been accused of acting out of spite, emotion, or impulse. Princess Anne is the ultimate pragmatist. She operates with a clinical understanding of institutional survival. When she moved on this property transfer, she didn't convene a sprawling advisory committee. She didn't request a 6-month feasibility study from the Crown estate managers. She didn't softly leak the premise to the press to test the waters of public opinion. Instead, she moved with what stunned palace insiders have universally described as absolute, terrifying precision. She effortlessly sliced through decades of dense, suffocating court bureaucracy to legally execute a maneuver that felt significantly less like an administrative property transfer and vastly more like a sovereign declaration of intent. And the sole person she explicitly chose to inherit this massive responsibility was Catherine, not because Catherine demanded it, not because she deployed her PR team to fight for it, not because she was the loudest, most aggressive voice in the negotiating room. She chose Catherine because, in Princess Anne's coldly accurate, fiercely protective assessment of the monarchy's long-term survival, the Princess of Wales represents the only viable, uncompromised future of the institution. That is the unvarnished logic. That is the foundational reasoning behind the signature. And frankly, when you lay out the chess pieces with that kind of objective clarity, it makes a devastating kind of sense. Why on earth would you ever permanently entrust the late Queen's most private, sacred sanctuary to absolutely anyone other than the exact person who will be physically guiding the monarchy forward into the next generation? To fully grasp the intense, boiling anger radiating from the rival factions, you have to understand the specific nature of the estate in question. This is absolutely not just some random, sprawling piece of agricultural land or an empty, drafty castle used for ceremonial photo opportunities. This specific estate was the ultimate refuge. It was the heavily guarded, deeply private sanctuary where Queen Elizabeth went to actually, genuinely breathe. It was the only geographical location on the planet where she could briefly step out from underneath the crushing, unending weight of the crown and simply exist as a human being. Every single ancient stone pathway, every secluded cottage hidden in the woodlands, every piece of historic timber framing the main residence was directly, personally shaped by her quiet choices over a span of 70 years. This was the absolute beating heart of her solitude. And for years, lingering quietly in the drawing rooms and corridors of the palace, there had been a series of what you might politely call highly presumptuous assumptions about exactly who would inevitably end up controlling it. Certain highly ambitious factions within the royal ecosystem had essentially begun operating under the arrogant assumption that the property would naturally, organically, flow toward whoever maintained the closest physical proximity to the current reigning monarch. Informal, highly speculative plans were already being drafted. Future, high society events were being grandly envisioned for the grounds. Private, back-channel arrangements and subtle promises were actively being discussed over expensive dinners. The entire extended circle just comfortably assumed that the traditional, proximity-based power structures of the court would blindly hold up. Princess Anne apparently looked at that creeping web of presumption, evaluated the long-term threat it posed to her mother's sanctuary, and delivered an absolute non-negotiable no. The exact second that highly classified document was placed flat on the mahogany desk, and Anne legally pressed her authority into the execution of the transfer, the entire fragile house of cards that the rival faction had built completely collapsed. But here is where the internal palace dynamics become incredibly messy. Because the people who lost this invisible war absolutely did not see it coming, and they did not take it well. The visceral reaction from the wider circle surrounding Camilla's extended family and loyalist courtiers was, by absolutely all credible accounts, catastrophic. And we must tread carefully through these complex dynamics, as the narrative relies on what elite royal commentators have painstakingly pieced together through highly placed, heavily vetted sources. Yet the unified picture that aggressively emerges from those leaks is one of genuine, breath-stealing shock, followed instantly by blinding fury. These were powerful, deeply connected individuals who genuinely, fundamentally believed that their direct proximity to the current throne automatically guaranteed them a commanding voice in historical, legacy-defining decisions exactly like this one. They had spent months, and in several specific cases, multiple years, meticulously cultivating deep influence. They had aggressively negotiated access to private royal lands. They had confidently made promises and struck alliances behind heavily guarded closed doors, entirely based on the incredibly arrogant assumption that the established, sycophantic order of the palace would always be blindly respected. And then, without a single warning shot, Princess Anne sat down, signed a legally binding piece of paper, and rendered absolutely every single one of those carefully laid plans completely, utterly irrelevant. The sheer, suffocating sense of betrayal radiating within those specific circles must have been absolutely overwhelming. You don't experience seasoned, unflappable courtiers losing their legendary composure over a piece of good news. The metaphorical shattering of porcelain against the parquet floors of the palace, that is the exact, specific kind of visceral reaction that only ever occurs when someone suddenly, horrifyingly realizes that the elaborate, high-stakes game they thought they were masterfully playing actually ended hours ago, and they weren't even informed. What makes this entire explosive standoff so incredibly fascinating from an analytical, outside perspective is that the boiling anger doesn't actually seem to be rooted in the physical land itself. Let's be entirely realistic for a moment. The extended families and inner circles operating at this elite level of the stratosphere are absolutely not struggling for resources. This fierce pushback is not fundamentally about acquiring more acres, boosting property portfolio values, or securing agricultural revenue streams. It is entirely, 100% about relevance. It is about the sudden, terrifying, dawning realization that their hard-won authority is fleeting. Their power is explicitly, inextricably tied to the present moment, to this specific, current reign. They are terrified by the undeniable confirmation that the actual long-term future of the institution actively belongs to people who are fundamentally not them. Catherine's operational authority, on the exact other hand, is tethered to a reality that absolutely cannot be negotiated, politicked, or lobbied away by ambitious courtiers. She is going to be the queen. That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is not a maybe. That is not a situation where we just have to wait and see how the public relations optics shake out over the next decade. That is the concrete, biological, and constitutional future of the British establishment. And by executing this transfer, Princess Anne just made it devastatingly, publicly clear to the entire royal apparatus that when it comes to fiercely protecting Queen Elizabeth's most personal, sacred legacy, the permanence of the future matters infinitely more than the fragile politics of the present. Now, the specific timeline of this execution is incredibly vital to pay attention to, because this was absolutely not a frantic, snap decision made in the heat of the moment. According to the deeply sourced accounts that have slowly bubbled to the surface, Princess Anne had actually been sitting on deep, structural concerns regarding the estate for quite a while. She had apparently, astutely identified a rapidly growing, highly ambitious network of private commercial interests and extended family influences that were beginning to quietly, aggressively encroach upon the estate's philosophical and physical boundaries. We are talking about outside figures, wealthy opportunists, and peripheral family members who fundamentally saw the historic property not as a sacred sanctuary to be preserved, but strictly as an underutilized asset. They saw something that could eventually be modernized, developed, leveraged for social capital, or slowly parceled out over time for elite access. Anne's internal defensive calculation was brutally, perfectly simple. If the ultimate control of the estate remained dangerously tied to the shifting, unpredictable personal influences surrounding the current reign, it would inevitably, tragically, be stripped of its deep historical meaning. The absolute only way to protect the sanctuary permanently, to lock it away from the vultures, was to place it directly into hands that simply could not be moved, could not be pressured by courtiers, and absolutely could not be outmaneuvered by palace politics. Catherine was the one, single person in the entire royal ecosystem who flawlessly checked every single one of those critical boxes. She possesses the unshakable public trust. She embodies the necessary generational stability. And, most importantly, she isn't going anywhere. But the actual, unbelievable twist in this saga, the specific, cinematic detail that aggressively elevates this narrative from standard palace drama into something genuinely, historically remarkable, is exactly what the opposing legal team discovered when they frantically started digging through the royal archives looking for a way to stop it. Because once the initial, paralyzing shock finally wore off and the rival circle began loudly making noise about aggressively challenging the legal validity of Anne's transfer, their highly paid researchers went desperately searching for any obscure historical precedent, any hidden constitutional loophole, or any technicality that might somehow help their case. What those researchers actually found instead was the ultimate checkmating royal trump card, buried deep at the bottom of a highly secured, classified archival file box, sealed perfectly with the sovereign's own personal wax crest, and dated several years before any of this current, bitter conflict ever began, was a legally binding addendum. Inside was a codicil, a fiercely guarded legal directive written entirely, unmistakably in Queen Elizabeth's own handwriting, and the explosive contents of that single document basically rendered every single factional objection entirely, humiliatingly moot before it was even officially raised. The late Queen had not only possessed the terrifying, brilliant foresight to anticipate this exact, specific power struggle breaking out over her property, but she had already explicitly, legally decided exactly how it should be permanently handled. The estate was officially, permanently designated as an unalterable, untouchable sanctuary exclusively reserved for the direct future of the crown. It was legally, fiercely shielded from any opportunistic claims made by extended family members, step-relatives, or temporary, highly ambitious court factions. Catherine wasn't just Princess Anne's pragmatic choice for the estate. Catherine was Queen Elizabeth's explicit, documented choice. It was formalized, it was legally sealed, and it had been sitting silently in the dark, patiently waiting for the exact right historical moment to be ruthlessly executed. That specific, undeniable archival detail is the turning point that permanently changes the entire complexion of the power dynamic, because up until the exact second that historic envelope was broken open and the Queen's handwriting was verified, the deeply angry people fiercely fighting against this transfer could easily frame the narrative to their advantage. They could quietly leak to the press that this was a hostile power play. They could frame it as Princess Anne aggressively overstepping her boundaries. They could paint it as a sudden, highly emotional move that hadn't been properly, constitutionally considered by the reigning monarch. But the moment that hidden codicil saw the light of day, the entire foundation of their argument violently, spectacularly collapsed. You simply cannot loudly claim to the press that you are valiantly defending the late Queen's true wishes when the late Queen's actual, legally binding written words explicitly, directly contradict every single thing you are arguing. You absolutely cannot engage in a debate about historical royal precedent when the ultimate precedent was proactively set in stone by the defining monarch of the century, locked in a document that your own ambitious researchers hadn't bothered to anticipate. Every single whispered accusation, every frantic internal protest, every carefully coordinated media leak attempting to question or undermine Catherine's sudden elevation, absolutely all of it ran straight, face first, into the impenetrable concrete wall of Queen Elizabeth's explicit, unyielding final directive. The legal structure built around the transfer was instantly proven to be entirely ironclad. The decision was absolute and final. And everyone who had just spent weeks aggressively, loudly raging against the unfairness of the situation suddenly, embarrassingly, had to confront the cold, hard reality of their defeat. They weren't actually fighting a rogue Princess Anne at all. They were fruitlessly fighting a master plan that had been quietly, brilliantly set in motion years ago by a legendary woman who knew exactly, precisely how the vultures would circle after she was gone. The absolute, undeniable strategic brilliance of Princess Anne's execution becomes infinitely clearer the closer you analyze the timeline. She didn't merely facilitate the transfer of a highly valuable piece of property. She actively, deliberately created an impenetrable, legal and optical barrier entirely around it. By officially putting Catherine in absolute control and backing that move with the undeniable newly discovered legal directives of the late Queen, Anne made it functionally, legally impossible for creeping commercial interests, wealthy developers, or shifting, opportunistic court factions to ever lay a single finger on the estate. Catherine is the undeniable future queen. Her unshakable position within the institutional hierarchy is absolutely not dependent on who is currently in favor at court, which aides have the king's ear this week, or the fluctuating popularity polls of the extended family. She operates completely beyond that petty fray. And Anne astutely recognized that fiercely protecting Queen Elizabeth's ultimate sanctuary required physically placing it entirely beyond the reach of toxic palace politics. That is not a petty, vindictive administrative maneuver. That is profound, long-term institutional thinking from a woman who has spent her entire, highly observant life watching exactly how the levers of power actually work behind the golden gates. For Catherine, the sheer, crushing weight of this sudden responsibility is incredibly hard to overstate. She is absolutely not celebrating this transfer. She is not popping champagne, and she is certainly not doing a vindictive victory lap around the factions who tried to block her. The reliable inside accounts describe her currently sitting quietly, deeply focused, surrounded by massive, dense estate plans. She is meticulously reviewing complex agricultural sustainability reports, studying long-term conservation proposals, and absorbing the operational history of the land. She is doing this while remaining painfully aware that every single management decision she makes regarding this sanctuary from this point forward will be intensely, unfairly scrutinized by the exact same people who are actively, bitterly waiting for her to fail. When she walks those ancient, quiet, tree-lined paths where Queen Elizabeth once actively sought her most profound solitude, the heavy responsibility settles on her shoulders in a way that probably cannot be fully, accurately explained to anyone who exists outside of that intensely pressurized world. This estate is absolutely not a luxury gift. It is a sacred trust, and by all accounts, Catherine seems to understand the gravity of that distinction completely. Prince William, for his part as the ultimate enforcer of this new reality, has apparently made his defensive position absolutely, terrifyingly clear to anyone foolish enough to ask. Any further attempt by any faction to subtly undermine Catherine's new appointment, or any quiet campaign to challenge Princess Anne's execution of the transfer, will be met with his absolute total resistance. He intimately watched his grandmother slowly, lovingly build and maintain this sanctuary over decades. He knows exactly, specifically what the quiet refuge meant to her mental survival, and he has absolutely zero intention of letting anyone carve it up, leverage it, or exploit it for their own social or financial benefit. The message originating from his specific quarter of the palace is entirely unambiguous. This is done. This is morally and legally right. And this is absolutely, unconditionally not up for debate. The much broader systemic implications of this massive power play are deeply worth thinking about as we watch the modern monarchy evolve. This sudden, brutal transfer firmly signals a seismic shift that goes far, far beyond the deed to one single piece of property. It is the ultimate changing of the guard. It is a quiet, incredibly polite, but entirely unmistakable declaration that the era of temporary, proximity-based, silent influence is rapidly drawing to a definitive close. The absolute, undeniable future of the British monarchy is William and Catherine. And surgical, unyielding decisions exactly like this one make that fast-approaching reality increasingly harder for the old guard to ignore, manipulate, or delay. Princess Anne, by choosing to act exactly when she did, and utilizing the precise, devastating methods she used, basically forced the entire dragging institution to aggressively look forward instead of constantly looking sideways. She willingly, bravely took the intense, burning heat of the internal storm entirely upon herself, absorbing the immediate fury of the rival factions, so that William and Catherine could seamlessly step into their rightful future without any compromised, messy legacies or property disputes trailing behind them. That is not just family loyalty. That is the ultimate strategic institutional sacrifice from a woman who has never once asked the public for credit, and who probably never ever will. The ambitious people who ultimately lost this bitter fight, and it is practically impossible to call it anything other than a devastating total loss at this point, are now trapped in a completely impossible, humiliating position. They cannot continue actively opposing the land transfer without explicitly, publicly defying Queen Elizabeth's newly documented, legally binding final wishes. They cannot attempt to frame the move as a rogue, aggressive action orchestrated by an out-of-control Princess Anne without looking completely foolish for not doing their own archival homework. And they absolutely cannot argue to the press that Catherine is somehow unworthy or unprepared for the task, without simultaneously attacking the infallible judgment of both the beloved late Queen and one of the absolute most respected, hard-working royals in modern British history. The suffocating silence that instantly followed the dramatic discovery of the archive tells you absolutely everything you need to know about who holds the real power. The intense, boiling power struggle ended not with a massive, screaming public confrontation in the press, but with a simple, quiet piece of paper that had been sitting silently in a dark file box for years, patiently waiting for exactly this moment to strike. What permanently sticks with me about this entire, incredible situation is how absolutely, perfectly, it illustrates the massive, fundamental difference between mere influence and true authority. Camilla's extended circle undeniably had influence. They had excellent access. They had immense physical proximity to the current throne. They possessed the unique, enviable ability to make things happen through quiet, whispered conversations, high society dinners, and heavily implied expectations. But Catherine now possesses authority, the exact kind of ironclad authority that is written down in ink, the kind that is permanently, legally binding, the kind that is fiercely backed by the explicit, undeniable instructions of a legendary monarch who astutely planned for this exact battle long before anyone else in the room was even thinking about it. Influence can easily be lost. It can be shifted by a scandal, it can be outmaneuvered by a smarter player, but authority, genuine, documented, historical authority, is infinitely harder to dislodge. And Princess Anne understood that vital, structural distinction vastly better than absolutely anyone else operating in that palace. The late Queen's distinct, unmistakable handwriting on those pages, the highly specific, unbendable conditions she carefully outlined, and the absolute clarity of her vision for exactly who should protect the sanctuary and why, all of it heavily points to a level of institutional foresight that is genuinely, terrifyingly striking. She deeply knew the intense factional tensions that would inevitably arise. She knew exactly which opportunistic people would try to aggressively push the boundaries, and which specific factions would try to redirect her private assets for their own long-term benefit. And instead of simply crossing her fingers and blindly hoping that the family would peacefully work it out amongst themselves, she left a loaded weapon behind. She left specific, binding, completely legally enforceable instructions that sat perfectly quiet in an archive until the exact, precise millisecond they were needed to protect the crown. That is not just elder wisdom. That is a masterclass in ruthlessly protecting what actually matters, actively ruling the chessboard from beyond the grave. For the rival factions, the extended family, and the wider circle of courtiers that had arrogantly built their entire future expectations around controlling this estate, the bitter, humiliating reckoning is probably still settling in. The quiet, insidious influence they had spent years cultivating, the carefully negotiated elite access, the subtle, ambitious promises made in private, hushed conversations, absolutely all of it dissolved into thin air the exact moment that red wax seal was officially broken. There is absolutely no internal appeal process for this defeat. There is no clever legal workaround. There is no PR spin that can fix it. The late Queen made her ultimate, unshakable choice. Princess Anne flawlessly, ruthlessly executed it. And Catherine, the Princess of Wales, now permanently carries it forward. Anyone left in the palace who still desperately wants to keep fighting this invisible war now has the impossible task of explicitly explaining to the world exactly why they think they know vastly better than Queen Elizabeth herself. Good luck with that argument. Princess Anne's pivotal, unrelenting role in absolutely all of this is the one specific thing I constantly keep coming back to. She absolutely did not have to do this. She could have easily, safely, let the chips fall where they may. She could have let the sacred estate get slowly pulled into whatever commercial, political, or factional currents were swirling around the current reign, and absolutely nobody in the press or the public would have blamed her for quietly staying out of the mess. Instead, she stepped directly, willingly, into the absolute line of fire. She took the immediate, vicious backlash. She absorbed the blinding anger of the ambitious courtiers, and she made absolutely 100% certain that the final outcome was securely locked in before anyone could even attempt to stop it. She acted as an impenetrable human shield, so that William and Catherine wouldn't have to muddy their own hands fighting this brutal internal battle themselves. That is the absolute definition of duty in its purest, most undiluted form. There was no glossy press release. There was no smiling, orchestrated photo op. There was no carefully managed public image campaign to boost her own popularity. There was just a signature on a vital historical document and a terrifying willingness to stand fiercely behind it, absolutely no matter who in the palace got upset. The lasting, enduring image of Catherine quietly walking those ancient, tree-lined paths, deeply understanding that she is now solely responsible for preserving something that meant absolutely everything to the late Queen, that is the true, emotional core of this entire story. It is not about pettiness. It is not about winning a real estate war. It is not about defeating royal rivals, crushing extended family members, or proving arrogant points to the press. It is entirely about humbly accepting a massive, historical weight that someone else explicitly, deliberately chose you to carry, and then ensuring you carry it with the exact, unyielding dignity that the massive responsibility demands. Queen Elizabeth deliberately built this sanctuary as a place of absolute, unbroken peace. Catherine's fundamental job now is to make absolutely certain that it stays that way for the next generation and the one immediately after that. Given absolutely everything we have seen from her over the tumultuous years, the steady, unblinking focus, the absolute refusal to ever get dragged into petty tabloid conflicts, the quiet, relentless dedication to the work itself, it is incredibly hard to imagine absolutely anyone better suited to the monumental task. Years from now, when royal historians look back at this highly volatile, transitional period of the monarchy, they probably won't spend much time obsessing over the frantic private meetings, the shattered teacups, or the panicked, furious phone calls echoing between the various palace offices. What they will clearly see is the exact defining moment Princess Anne made a calculated choice that permanently protected Queen Elizabeth's most personal legacy from becoming just another leveraged asset to be traded by ambitious courtiers. They will see a defining historical decision that aggressively prioritized the long-term future over the messy political present and absolute permanence over temporary convenience. And they will see Catherine, the Princess of Wales, standing firmly on ground that was entrusted to her, not because of dirty palace politics, not because of PR manipulation, and not because of court favoritism, but because two entirely different generations of fiercely dedicated royal women looked directly at her and saw the exact unyielding person who would protect what actually mattered. The rival factions can absolutely keep whispering in the dark. The wild tabloid speculation can keep swirling in the Sunday papers, but the foundation resting underneath absolutely all of it is now solid as a rock. Princess Anne made absolutely sure of that, and somewhere, looking down on the entire, brilliantly executed maneuver, you have to think that Queen Elizabeth knew exactly, precisely what she was doing when she left those hidden instructions behind. She deeply understood the ambitious personalities, the crushing institutional pressures, and the quiet, vicious battles that would inevitably, destructively unfold once she was no longer physically there to oversee things directly. That hidden, archival codicil wasn't just a simple legal safeguard for a piece of land. It was a massive, undeniable message from the past, flawlessly delivered at precisely the exact right historical moment, ruthlessly reminding absolutely everyone in the palace that even in her absence, her will would absolutely, undeniably hold. And it did.